The rubber tank sat motionless in the French countryside, its barrel pointed toward the German lines. From a distance, it looked like every other M4 Sherman in the American arsenal. But if you got close enough, you'd discover something extraordinary. 4 men could lift it over their heads. It was inflatable, fake, a theatrical prop in the middle of the deadliest war in human history. This was the work of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army. And in the summer of 1944, they were about to pull off a deception so audacious, so impossibly theatrical, that it would save thousands of American lives and change the course of the war in Europe. June 1944. The Allied invasion of Normandy had succeeded, but now came the hard part, breaking out of France and pushing toward Germany. The problem was simple and terrifying. The Germans knew where every American division was positioned. They had reconnaissance planes, spies, informants. Moving 30,000 troops without the enemy noticing was impossible, unless you could make them look somewhere else. Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simonson received orders that seemed like a joke. His unit of 100 men needed to impersonate the 30,000-strong 2nd Armoured Division, while the real division moved to launch a surprise attack elsewhere. They had to convince German intelligence that an entire armoured division remained in position when it had actually vanished. The Ghost Army wasn't made up of elite soldiers or hardened commandos. They were artists. Fashion designers, sound engineers, Broadway set designers, men who had spent their civilian lives creating illusions for department store windows and radio shows. Now they had to create the most important illusion of their lives. The unit included fashion designer Bill Blass, photographer Art Kane, and painter Ellsworth Kelly, who would later become one of America's most celebrated artists. These men understood something the traditional military didn't. Perception is reality. If you could control what the enemy saw and heard, you could control what they believed. The Ghost Army's arsenal was unlike anything in military history. They had inflatable tanks made of rubber that could be set up in 15 minutes, inflatable trucks, inflatable artillery pieces. From 500 yards away, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. German reconnaissance pilots photographing Allied positions would see exactly what the Ghost Army wanted them to see. But visual deception was only half the illusion. This is where the operation became truly ingenious. The Ghost Army's sonic deception unit had recorded actual tank movements, artillery fire, and troop activities onto state-of-the-art wire recorders. They had sounds of bridge construction, tank columns moving through mud, supply trucks idling. These recordings could be played through speakers mounted on half-tracks, projecting the sounds of military activity up to 15 miles away. Imagine being a German soldier, a German, in a forward observation post at night. You can't see much, but you can hear everything. The rumble of tank engines, the clank of treads on roads, the shouted orders of American officers, radio chatter. Everything tells you that thousands of enemy soldiers are preparing for an offensive right in front of you. Every sound was a lie. But the Ghost Army took the deception even further, into the realm of pure psychological warfare. They understood that German intelligence would be listening to everything, watching everything, analysing patterns. So they created patterns. Ghost Army soldiers would visit nearby French towns in uniform, loudly discussing their unit assignments in bars where they knew locals would overhear and potentially pass information to German agents. They wore fake shoulder patches of the units they were impersonating. They sent radio messages they knew the Germans would intercept, using the real call signs and communication patterns of actual divisions. An officer might complain loudly about the mud bogging down their tanks. Another would ask a French civilian for directions to a town in the opposite direction of where the real attack was planned. Every detail was carefully scripted, rehearsed, performed. The Germans were watching a stage play and didn't know it. Operation Viersen, the ultimate test, September 1944. The war had reached a critical moment. The Allies were approaching the German border, but the Wehrmacht was far from defeated. The US Ninth Army planned to cross the Rhine River near the German town of Viersen, but the area was heavily defended. Any indication of troop buildup would bring devastating German counterattacks. The Ghost Army received their most dangerous assignment yet. They needed to make the Germans believe that 2 entire divisions, approximately 40,000 troops, were gathering for an attack at a completely different location, miles away from the real crossing point. For this mission, everything had to be perfect. The inflatable tanks had to be positioned exactly where real tanks would be. The sonic deceptions had to match the timeline of actual military operations. The radio traffic had to convince German intelligence analysts who had been studying American communication patterns for years, and they had to do all of this within sight and sound of German positions. The Ghost Army moved into position under cover of darkness. Teams of soldiers inflated hundreds of rubber tanks, artillery pieces, and trucks. They created the visual signature of a massive military build-up. When dawn broke, German reconnaissance pilots photographed exactly what they were meant to see: an American armoured force preparing for a major offensive. At the same time, the sonic deception unit played their recordings. The sounds of tank columns, supply convoys, engineering units building bridges echoed across the countryside. German listening posts dutifully recorded everything and sent reports up the chain of command. The radio deception teams broadcast on the frequencies of the actual divisions they were impersonating, creating a storm of military traffic that German intelligence could intercept and analyse. Every message was crafted to reinforce the illusion. Requests for ammunition, weather reports, orders to subordinate units, all fake, all perfectly believable. But here's what made the Ghost Army's work truly dangerous. They had to stay in position even as German artillery began targeting their concentration of forces. Real shells began falling on fake tanks. The Ghost Army soldiers couldn't retreat without giving away the deception. They had to hold their positions, maintaining the illusion even as explosions tore apart their inflatable equipment. Men crouched in foxholes while artillery fire destroyed rubber tanks they'd spent hours inflating. The psychological pressure was immense. These weren't combat soldiers trained for frontline fighting. They were artists and engineers playing dress-up in a killing field. But they held their positions because they understood what was at stake. 20 miles away, the real Ninth Army was crossing the Rhine under minimal resistance. German forces were concentrated at the wrong location, preparing to counter an attack that would never come. The Ghost Army's deception had worked perfectly. Private Harold Dahl's story captures both the genius and the terror of Ghost Army operations. A sound engineer from Brooklyn, Dahl found himself operating sonic deception equipment just 300 yards from German lines during the Viersen operation. His half-track was loaded with speakers playing recordings of tank movements. The volume had to be loud enough to convince German listeners that real armour was moving into position, but not so loud that it sounded artificial or gave away his position too precisely. Dahl sat in his vehicle, adjusting playback levels, while German machine gun fire occasionally cut through the darkness. He was close enough to hear German soldiers talking in their own trenches, close enough that if they'd realised the sounds were recorded, they could have overrun his position in minutes. For 6 hours, he played his recordings on a continuous loop. Tank engines starting, gears grinding, treads clanking, orders being shouted. He varied the playback, creating the impression of realistic military activity, all while hoping the Germans wouldn't send a patrol to investigate. When he finally withdrew before dawn, German artillery began pounding the exact location where his speakers had been positioned. If he'd stayed 15 minutes longer, he would have died maintaining a lie. After the war, Dahl never spoke about his service. When his children asked what he did in WWII, he would only say he worked with sound equipment. It wasn't until decades later that the Ghost Army's missions were declassified and his family learned the truth. What made the Ghost Army truly unique wasn't just their deception techniques, it was the kind of men who executed them. These soldiers approached warfare as a creative problem. They thought like set designers, not generals. Bill Blass, who would later dress presidents and movie stars, spent his time in France designing fake shoulder patches and creating realistic-looking documents to be accidentally left where German intelligence might find them. His eye for detail, honed in New York fashion houses, now served to create paper trails for divisions that didn't exist. Ellsworth Kelly painted camouflage patterns on inflatable equipment, understanding how light and shadow would appear from the air. His artistic training in color theory and perspective became tactical skills. The same principles he'd use after the war to create minimalist masterpieces, he applied to making rubber tanks look real from 10,000 feet. Art Kane, future photographer of jazz legends and fashion icons, documented the Ghost Army's operations with a camera. His photographs, classified for decades, show the surreal reality of theatrical warfare. Soldiers inflating tanks with bicycle pumps, speakers mounted on vehicles playing tank sounds into empty fields, painted canvas replacing steel armor. These men kept journals and sketches throughout the war, documenting their operations with an artist's eye. They understood they were participating in something unprecedented, a military campaign waged with props and performances rather than bullets and bombs. But they also paid a price. Several Ghost Army soldiers were killed or wounded during operations. German artillery didn't distinguish between real and fake targets. The stress of maintaining deceptions under fire took its toll. Some men developed what we'd now call PTSD, haunted not by combat but by the constant pressure of performance, knowing that any mistake could expose the illusion and doom thousands of real soldiers. Not every Ghost Army operation succeeded. In October 1944, during Operation Brest, the deception nearly failed catastrophically. The mission was to convince German forces defending the French port city of Brest that American forces were much larger than they actually were, encouraging surrender. The Ghost Army deployed their full arsenal of tricks, but a German patrol captured one of the inflatable tanks intact. Within hours, German intelligence knew about the deception. Radio intercepts showed German officers discussing the discovery, calling it Gummipanzer, rubber tanks. The Ghost Army command faced a terrible decision. If the Germans publicly exposed the deception, it could compromise every future operation. The entire concept of the Ghost Army would become worthless. Their solution was brilliantly audacious. They doubled down. Instead of retreating, they deployed even more fake equipment, creating such an overwhelming visual presence that German commanders couldn't be sure which tanks were real and which were rubber. They mixed real artillery units with fake ones, making it impossible for the Germans to know what to believe. The psychological warfare worked. German commanders, already demoralized and facing actual American forces, chose to interpret the inflatable tanks as part of a larger legitimate force rather than as evidence that the entire American presence was fake. Their reports mentioned the rubber tanks but concluded these were just a supplement to real armor, not a replacement for it. Brest surrendered days later. The Ghost Army's deception had survived its greatest test. When the war ended in 1945, the Ghost Army was quietly disbanded. Their equipment was destroyed or buried. Their records were classified top secret. The men were ordered never to speak about their service, and they didn't. For decades, Bill Blass became a fashion icon without ever mentioning he'd helped deceive the Wehrmacht. Ellsworth Kelly's obituaries praised his artistic genius without noting he'd painted fake tanks in France. Art Kane photographed everyone from Miles Davis to Muhammad Ali, never revealing he documented one of Chaucer's strangest military units. The Ghost Army's veterans went to reunions for other units they'd served with, but never mentioned the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Their wives and children knew their fathers had served in Europe, but not what they'd done there. Secret clearances remained in effect long after the war ended. It wasn't until 1996 that the Ghost Army's records were fully declassified. By then, many of the veterans had died. Those who remained finally could tell their stories. Rick Beyer and Elizabeth Sales produced a documentary in 2013 that brought the Ghost Army's story to wider attention. Veterans, now in their 80s and 90s, describe their missions on camera for the first time. Their children learned details their fathers had kept secret for nearly 70 years. The Ghost Army conducted more than 20 major deception operations between June 1944 and the war's end. Military historians estimate their work saved between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives by misleading German forces and preventing them from concentrating troops effectively. But their legacy extends beyond casualty numbers. The Ghost Army proved that warfare isn't just about firepower, it's about perception. They demonstrated that creativity and innovation could be as powerful as artillery. They showed that in war, as in art, the most important thing is what the audience believes they're seeing. Modern military deception tactics descend directly from Ghost Army techniques. Every fake radar installation, every decoy aircraft, every piece of military misinformation traces its lineage to those artists in France inflating rubber tanks. The Ghost Army also represented something unique in military history, a unit where artistic training was more valuable than combat experience, where creativity was weaponized, where the skills of peacetime became the tools of war. These men went to war with paintbrushes and sound equipment instead of rifles. They fought with illusions instead of bullets, and they won. The Ghost Army's final operation came in March 1945 along the Rhine River near Mainz. By this point, the war in Europe was nearly over. German forces were collapsing, retreating into Germany itself, but they could still kill, and every Allied soldier's life still mattered. For the last time, the Ghost Army deployed their inflatable tanks, their sound trucks, their radio deceptions. They created the phantom of a massive force preparing to cross the Rhine at one location, while the real crossing happened miles away. It worked. German artillery pounded empty fields while American troops crossed the river under light resistance. The Ghost Army had pulled off one final deception. A week later, they learned their unit was being disbanded. The elaborate deceptions that had been so crucial to Allied success were no longer needed. The war was nearly over. On the last day, the men of the Ghost Army deflated their rubber tanks one final time. They packed away their sound equipment, they removed the fake insignia from their uniforms, and then they were transferred to other units, sworn to secrecy, and sent home to lives that would never include the truth of what they'd done. In 2013, the Ghost Army veterans received the Congressional Gold Medal, one of America's highest civilian honors. Many of the men who had carried this secret for decades were no longer alive to receive it, but their families accepted on their behalf, finally understanding what their fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers had accomplished. The medals recognized something profound, that courage in war doesn't always mean charging into enemy fire. Sometimes it means standing perfectly still while artillery falls around you, maintaining an illusion. Sometimes it means being creative when everyone else is trying to destroy. Sometimes it means using art to save lives. The Ghost Army's inflatable tanks are now in museums. Their recordings are in archives. Their story is finally being told. But for decades, these men carried the weight of an impossible secret that they'd helped win the greatest war in history, not with violence, but with creativity, not with strength, but with deception, not by destroying the enemy, but by making them look the wrong way. They were artists who became warriors, illusionists who saved thousands of lives, the Ghost Army, and for 50 years almost no one knew they existed.